You've tried to talk yourself out of it. You've told yourself to focus on something else, anything else, and for a few minutes, it works. And then, without warning, he's back. Not because you called him back into your mind. He just arrives there, uninvited, the way weather arrives. You don't summon it. You just find yourself standing in it. You've probably wondered if something is wrong with you, if you're overthinking, if you're one of those women who builds an entire emotional world around someone who barely thinks of her at all. I want to tell you something before we go any further, because I don't think you're going to hear it anywhere else today. The persistence of a thought is not proof of nothing. It's not proof of everything either, but it is data, and most women have never been taught how to read it correctly. So today, I'm going to walk you through 7 specific things that are very often happening inside a man's inner world when a woman finds herself unable to stop thinking about him. Some of these will surprise you because they don't look anything like what you'd expect connection to look like from the outside. Some of them will be uncomfortable because they will ask you to consider that not every persistent thought is destiny. Some of it is your own unfinished business wearing his face. By the time we're done, you won't need to wonder anymore. You'll know exactly what to look for in him and in yourself. Before we get into the 7 things, I want to tell you about a woman named Elise, because her situation is going to feel familiar to a lot of you, and it's going to make everything that follows much easier to apply to your own life. Elise met a man at a mutual friend's dinner party. Nothing about the meeting was dramatic. There was no lightning bolt, no cinematic moment, just an easy conversation that ran long after everyone else had moved on to other topics. He walked her to her car. He texted the next morning, something small and unremarkable. And then, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, she found herself thinking about him constantly, during meetings, while cooking dinner, in the specific quiet stretch of time right before sleep, when the mind stops performing and starts wandering toward whatever it's actually preoccupied with. For weeks, the contact between them was inconsistent. He'd text with real warmth, then go quiet for days. He'd make a comment that sounded like he was imagining a future together, then pull back into something more casual the very next time they spoke. Elise did what most women in this situation do. She tried to explain it using the only framework she'd ever been given. He's either interested or he's not. He's either communicating or he's playing games. This is either going somewhere or it's a waste of her time. But that framework didn't actually explain what she was observing, and it didn't quiet the thoughts either. What finally helped her wasn't a rule about texting frequency. It was learning to ask a completely different question, not what does this behavior mean about how he feels, but what is actually happening inside him that would produce behavior like this. That shift is what I want to give you today through 7 specific answers. I'll come back to Elise as we go, because what happened with her illustrates almost every one of these points in a way that's easier to recognize than abstract explanation alone. Let's begin with the first thing, because it's the one almost nobody talks about, honestly. Number 1, he's running from something he can't name yet, and you are standing near the exit. Here is what almost no one tells women about men and emotional avoidance. It rarely looks like disinterest. It looks like busyness. It looks like a full schedule that somehow never has room for depth. It looks like a man who is perfectly present for logistics or plans, jokes, the surface of a day, and strangely, consistently unavailable the moment a conversation drifts toward anything real. If you found yourself thinking about a man like this constantly, there's a good chance you sense something underneath his surface long before you could explain it. Women are often extraordinarily accurate at detecting depth in a man before he's ready to access it himself. You picked up on something, a flicker of sadness behind a joke, a pause before he answered a simple question, a tenderness he tried to bury under humor. And your mind, sensing that there was more to find, started returning to him the way you'd return to a locked door you suspected led somewhere important. Here's what's often happening on his side while this is happening on yours. He feels the pull toward depth too, but depth for many men has historically been associated with danger, being mocked, being told to toughen up, being taught that needing anyone is a weakness that gets exploited. So when a connection starts asking something real of him, his instinct isn't always to move toward it. Sometimes it's to create just enough distance to feel safe again, even while some part of him doesn't actually want that distance. This does not mean you should wait around for a man to overcome years of emotional conditioning on your behalf. It means understanding that when your mind won't let go of someone who seems avoidant, sometimes you are responding to something real in him, his own suppressed self, reaching for you before he's brave enough to reach with his hands. This was exactly what Elise was sensing without having the words for it. The man from the dinner party had a habit of steering conversations away from anything emotionally specific the moment they got close to something real. He'd crack a joke, he'd change the subject to something logistical. He'd ask her a question about her week instead of answering the one she'd just asked him about his. She didn't consciously register this pattern at first. She only knew that something about him felt like a book, with several chapters missing, and some part of her kept trying to read past the gaps. That instinct wasn't foolish, it was accurate. She was picking up on a real avoidance pattern. She just hadn't yet learned that recognizing the pattern and being able to change it are two very different things. Number 2, he has started measuring other women against a version of comfort you created without meaning to. This one is subtle, and it rarely gets named clearly, so let me be precise about it. When a man spends real time around a woman who makes him feel unguarded, not performed for, not managed, just actually himself, something in his nervous system quietly recalibrates what normal feels like. He may not be able to explain this to you or to himself, but the next time he's in a room with someone else, some part of him is running a silent comparison. Not, is she prettier? Not, is she more interesting? Something closer to, do I feel like myself around this person the way I did around her? This is one of the reasons certain men become almost impossible to fully forget, even for women who consciously believe they've moved on. It isn't always mutual in the sense of active longing, but often some baseline of what safety and ease feel like has already been reset by that connection, whether he ever admits it or not. If you're the one doing the thinking right now, ask yourself something honest. Did you feel like the most unguarded version of yourself around him? Because if so, there's a real chance you didn't just leave an impression, you left a new definition of comfort that he's now measuring everything else against, quietly, without meaning to. Number 3, he is delaying an emotion he hasn't finished feeling yet. This is the part of male psychology most women are never taught, and it explains so much of the confusion around timing in relationships. Women, broadly speaking, tend to process emotion in something closer to real time. You feel something, you notice it, you can often name it within the same conversation it arose in. Many men process on a delay. The feeling registers. The meaning of the feeling arrives later, sometimes much later, often in complete solitude, with no one around to witness it. This is why a man can seem entirely unaffected by a moment while it's happening, and then weeks later find himself unexpectedly undone by the memory of it, alone in his car, in the quiet before sleep, in a moment that has nothing to do with you on the surface, and everything to do with you underneath it. If you've been thinking about a man constantly since something ended, or since something never even fully started, understand this. You may be a full processing cycle ahead of him. Not more invested, not more real in your feelings, simply faster at metabolizing them into conscious understanding. He may still be sitting somewhere in the delay, carrying weight he hasn't identified the source of yet, quietly irritable or restless or distracted, without connecting any of it back to you. This doesn't guarantee he'll ever catch up to where you are. Some men never do. They let the delay run out the clock entirely, and the moment of understanding never fully arrives, or it arrives too late to matter. But it does explain why your intensity and his apparent calm can exist at the exact same time, about the exact same connection, without either of you being wrong about what you're experiencing. Elise eventually learned, months later, and somewhat by accident, that the man from the dinner party had told a close friend of his, almost in passing, that he couldn't stop thinking about that night, weeks after their contact had already gone quiet on his end. He hadn't said this to Elise. He hadn't acted on it in any way she could observe. He was, by every external measure, unavailable and inconsistent during exactly the window when he was privately still processing what their connection had stirred up in him. This is the frustrating, unglamorous truth about the delay. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear timeline. It simply exists quietly, sometimes for longer than anyone waiting on the other end can reasonably be expected to stay patient for. Number 4, he has started building a version of you in his mind that may not match who you actually are. I want to be careful here, because this is where things can get genuinely misleading if you don't understand the mechanism. When a man thinks about a woman repeatedly, especially across distance or silence, his mind doesn't simply replay memories with perfect accuracy. It edits, it fills gaps, it smooths over uncertainty with whatever narrative feels most emotionally coherent to him in that moment. This means a man can be thinking about you constantly and still be, in some sense, thinking about a version of you that his own mind constructed, softened where you were sharp, certain where you were actually scared, idealized in ways that flatten the complicated, specific, real person you actually are. This isn't malicious, it's simply what unresolved longing does to memory when it isn't regularly corrected by real contact. Here's why this matters for you. If a connection is only sustained by distance and imagination, it can feel enormous and permanent in his mind, while having almost nothing left to do with the actual relationship you'd build if you were both standing in the same room, dealing with real logistics, real disagreements, real Tuesday afternoon versions of each other. Some men do the work of reconciling the fantasy with reality and choose the real person anyway, more devotedly, because of it. Others stay attached to the idealized memory precisely because it never has to survive contact with anything difficult. Watch for which one you're dealing with, because they feel identical from a distance and are almost opposite up close. There's a particular kind of man who keeps a connection alive almost entirely through absence, who texts just often enough to stay present in your imagination, without ever providing the consistent in-person reality that would test whether the fantasy holds up. If you notice that a man seems more devoted to you in memory than he ever was in your actual presence, more romantic in a text message than he ever was sitting across from you, that's worth paying attention to. It doesn't necessarily mean he's manipulative. Often he isn't consciously doing anything at all, but a connection that only thrives on distance is telling you something important about its own limits, and it's worth listening to that information rather than only listening to how badly you want it to mean something else. Number 5, he is quietly reorganizing his own self-image around whether he's capable of being the man you deserve. This one tends to surprise people because it doesn't look like longing. It often looks like withdrawal or overcompensation or strange bursts of ambition that seem to come from nowhere. But underneath it, something specific is often happening. When a man meets a woman who genuinely moves something in him, it doesn't just activate desire, it activates evaluation. He starts, often unconsciously, measuring his own life against a new, higher bar, one shaped by the question of whether he's actually someone capable of holding what you represent to him. For some men, this triggers growth. They start showing up earlier, working harder, addressing the parts of their life they'd been neglecting, not because you demanded it, but because your presence made mediocrity suddenly feel unacceptable to them in a way it hadn't before. For other men, this same pressure triggers retreat. The gap between who they are and who they'd need to be to deserve you feels too large, too exposing, and instead of closing it, they simply disappear, protecting their ego from the discomfort of falling short where it would actually matter. Either way, if you sense that a man became different, more driven or more distant, more careful with himself around the same time your connection intensified, there's a real chance you didn't imagine that shift. You may have quietly become the measuring stick he's using to evaluate his own worth, whether or not he's ever said a word about it. Number 6, his body remembers you even when his schedule suggests otherwise. There is a difference between conscious attention and nervous system memory, and almost nobody explains this distinction clearly. A man can be extremely busy, genuinely occupied, not performing busyness as an excuse, and still carry a kind of somatic imprint of a connection that surfaces at unpredictable moments, a particular scent that stops him mid-stride, a song that makes his chest tighten before his mind catches up to why, a silence in a room that feels for half a second like the specific quality of silence he remembers sitting in with you. This is not the same as active, conscious longing, and I want to be honest with you about that difference because conflating them causes a lot of unnecessary pain. A man can have these moments of somatic recall and still not be building toward reaching out to you, still not be reorganizing his life around reconnecting. The body remembering is not the same as a decision being made, but it does mean that the connection left a genuine physiological mark. Not just a story you told yourself, not just wishful thinking dressed up as intuition. Something measurable happened between you, even if neither of you has the language or the courage to name it out loud. Number 7, and this is the one I most want you to sit with, because it changes how you'll interpret everything else I've told you today. He may not be thinking about you at all in the way you're thinking about him, and that doesn't necessarily mean nothing real exists. I know this sounds like a contradiction after everything I've just described. It isn't. Here's the distinction that matters. Emotional impact and emotional attention are not the same thing. A man can be genuinely affected by a connection, changed by it, shaped by it, carrying real imprints of it in the ways I've just described, without that impact translating into the specific, conscious, repetitive thinking you're experiencing. His mind might process the same connection as a mood, a restlessness, an unexplained flatness in his current relationships rather than as a clear, nameable thought about you specifically. This means you cannot use the intensity of your own thinking as reliable proof of the intensity of his, not because your feelings are wrong, but because feelings translate into different forms in different nervous systems. Your thinking about him constantly is real information about your own inner world. Always. Whether it's also information about his inner world requires something more than intensity to confirm. It requires evidence you can actually observe. Consistency, effort, movement toward you in the real world, not just the compelling, self-sustaining logic of a thought that won't quit. Now I want to bring all 7 of these together because scattered like this, they can feel like 7 separate mysteries. They're not. They're 7 expressions of one underlying truth. And understanding that truth is what will finally give you peace, whether or not this particular story ends the way you hope it will. The truth is this: when a connection is real, it does not stay contained in one person's mind. It leaks. It shows up in his behavior, even imperfectly, even inconsistently, even confusingly. It shows up in a nervous system he can't fully control, in comparisons he can't help making, in a self-image he's quietly renegotiating whether he says so or not. Real connection is messy and often silent, but it is rarely entirely one-sided in every single dimension. Something moves in him too, even if it's not identical to what's moving in you. But, and this is the part that requires real honesty, sometimes what feels like an undeniable mutual pull is actually your own mind completing a pattern it desperately wants closure on. The human brain does not tolerate open loops well. An unresolved connection, an unanswered question, a goodbye that didn't feel finished. These create a kind of psychological itch that the mind will scratch obsessively regardless of whether scratching it produces anything real. This isn't a character flaw. It's simply how minds work when they're denied resolution. But it does mean you have to be honest with yourself about which experience you're actually having, because they can feel remarkably, almost cruelly similar from the inside. So how do you tell the difference practically without driving yourself into more anxious analysis than you started with? You stop asking how strong the pull feels, because intensity will never give you a reliable answer. You start asking what exists outside your own mind. Has he shown up with any consistency at all, even imperfect consistency? Has he made any real effort that cost him something? Time by me, and then form, and shin, and then shin, torn, shin, time. Vulnerability, inconvenience, rather than effort that costs him nothing. Has anything about this connection moved forward in reality, in words spoken out loud, in plans that were kept, in small choices made in your favor when an easier option was available? Or does the entire relationship live inside your own head, sustained by memory, imagination, and the sheer discomfort of an unresolved ending? If you find real evidence, even small amounts of it, then what you're feeling deserves to be taken seriously, and everything I've described today, the delay, the somatic memory, the quiet self-reorganization, may genuinely be happening in him too, on his own timeline, in his own language. This is roughly where Elise ended up, though it took her longer than she would have liked to get there. She stopped asking herself every single day whether the silence meant he didn't care. She started simply watching, and over the following months, a pattern did eventually reveal itself. Not a dramatic one, but a real one. He came back imperfectly, in fits and starts, sometimes disappearing again just when things felt like they were solidifying, but each time he returned, something had shifted in him. He was more direct. He asked better questions. He started, slowly, to say the things he'd spent months only implying. It never became the clean, certain, effortless story she might have wanted. But it became real, in the sense that mattered most. It moved, on its own, outside the boundaries of her own mind, in ways she could actually point to and describe to a friend without needing to interpret or explain them away. This is, honestly, the most important thing I can leave you with today. The question was never really, is he thinking about me too? The deeper, more useful question is, what is it in me that needs him to be thinking about me? And can I meet that need myself so that whatever happens next, with him I'm not doing it from a place of desperation, but from a place of wholeness? Because here's what I've come to understand, watching pattern after pattern like this play out. The women who eventually find real, mutual, consistent love are rarely the ones who thought about a man the most intensely. They're the ones who learned to sit with that intensity without being ruled by it, who could feel the pull, respect it as information, and still keep both feet on their own ground while they waited to see whether reality would confirm what their mind kept insisting was true. If he is one of the men in whom all 7 of these things are genuinely happening, if his avoidance, his comparisons, his delayed processing, his quiet self-measurement, his body's memory of you, and yes, even his own thoughts, are all quietly orbiting around this connection. You won't need a video to tell you that. It will show up, imperfectly, on his timeline, in his own language, but it will show up in ways you can actually see, not just ways you have to convince yourself of. And if it doesn't show up, if all of this stays confined to your own mind, no matter how much time passes, that isn't a failure on your part. It's information. It's your own psyche asking you to turn the same attention you've been giving him back toward yourself, toward whatever it is in you that keeps reaching for someone who isn't reaching back and asking gently, what would it take for me to feel this complete without waiting on an answer from him at all? That question, more than anything he does or doesn't do, is where your real peace is waiting. If this gave you language for something you've been carrying quietly, let it settle for a moment before you move on. And if you want to keep understanding these patterns, the ones that shape who we love, why we can't stop thinking about certain people, and how to finally tell longing apart from truth, stay close. There's more here for you.